Okay, so while we're talking about the review of Genesis, you remember we got down through, I think, question 14 or 15 on Wednesday evening. We're still in the land of Goshen so far as the people of Israel are concerned. And so I ran across this picture the other day, and this is, of course, a modern picture of the area of Goshen. And not all of it had this much water, but this is one place where they had pasture and a good bit of water. Of course, you can see some modern buildings in the background, maybe a fence as well. But this is how green and how pretty it was in that area. When you think of Egypt, or at least when I think of Egypt, I think of sand and desert and how it would be very hot and arid. Well, obviously, this is a little bit different from that because we have an area, especially that region of the Nile Delta, where the Nile splits into all those cataracts as it flows into the southern section of the Mediterranean. That's very, very fertile, very prosperous, and this is where Joseph placed his people when they came, his family, when they came down to Egypt to live, and Pharaoh, of course, agreed with that and wanted them to be there in that fertile portion of the land. And what was so important about them being in an area like this?
They were to their self and not with Egypt, for one thing.
Okay.
And they were God's separate people, and they were not to be with the unfaithful people.
Okay, all right, they were separate. What else?
Plenty of water, it looks like vegetation for their flocks.
Okay. All right. Bill, did you have anything else?
They had to have enough room and enough pasture and water for all of their flocks.
Right. Right, and as we
small space.
Yes, as we studied in the past, Jacob and his family were very prosperous, and so they had a lot of animals, and so they would need a big area like that. And so this is just one portion of the land of Goshen that I thought would be interesting for us to take a look at. Okay, get back to where I'm supposed to be here. All right, so we got down then to talking about the covenant of circumcision, and that had to do with question number 13. What was the significance of that with the covenant between God and Abraham involving circumcision? And one of the things John mentioned just a moment ago in relation to the people being separate is that it set Abraham and his descendants apart from others. And that's one thing that's important that we note. And while God has not necessarily spoken about him choosing this particular people yet, he has given the promises, the land, nation, and seed promises. And as a result of that, he made this covenant with Abraham and his descendants concerning circumcision, that he would be a father of a separate, distinct, and great nation. And that has not yet come about, but it is in the process of coming about, as we see, especially between the time of the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus. We discussed question 14 concerning Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed and what that had to do with its influence upon and effect upon Abraham, and how Abraham tried to intercede for not only the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, but more especially for Lot and his family. And God listened to him and was very patient with him. God said, because of the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very great, go down to see what that is and want to destroy that area. And so Abraham pled with God on that occasion with the Lord, and he heard Abraham, and they got down to how many souls?
10.
10, yeah, 10 souls. If there's 10 souls there that are faithful, will you spare it? And the Lord said, for 10 I will spare it. Of course, we know the result of all of that, how that only Lot and his wife and his daughters were able to escape the city, but then Lot's wife looked back. So that brings us then down to number 15. How does the story of Isaac test Abraham's faith? So what do you have for that?
God, that he believed that God would resurrect Isaac or save Isaac in some way. But it also demonstrated the faith that even though it was his only son, he would do what God told him to do.
Right, that's right. Great faith shown there by Abraham. And you know, this is not something that God just sprung on him. It's something that he told him ahead of time. He says, now I want you to prepare to offer your son as a sacrifice. So they made the preparation with provisions. He took a couple of servants with him. They went 3 days travel. And all of this time, you know, Abraham's thinking about this and what he's got to do and how difficult that obviously would have been and all of those things. And so that indeed was something that was very, very, very faith-building for Abraham, but also very difficult. Let's look at Matthew chapter 3 and verse 9. Matthew chapter 3 and verse 9. And Dusty, if you would, when you get there, would you read that for us, please?
And I think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. For I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham.
Okay, so there John the Baptist is preaching, and he's preaching to the Jews that come to hear him, and they're very proud people by this time, and they're saying they're children of Abraham, and what need do we have of this one that you're prophesying about and all of that. And so John makes a statement that of these stones, God would be able to raise up children to Abraham. So that is part of the facts of the story concerning Isaac as well. But more importantly, Abraham understood that. And that's the point that Billy was making just a moment ago. Abraham did not say no. He didn't complain about it. He didn't try to bargain with God. He just obeyed, knowing that God would take care of it and do his will, whatever that would be. And that's just a tremendous amount of faith. And we need to think about that and understand the impact of that and how not only that impacted Abraham's lives, but essentially it impacted our lives too. Because Abraham is such a good example in that connection. Yes, Murphy?
I believe it was Bill Hall that said in the sermon I was listening to in my car on the MP3 that he had seen a television reenactment of that at one point, and of course you know how Hollywood messes up the Bible, and that when God told Abraham to offer him, they had him shaking his fist at God and saying, no, nothing can be further from the truth. They don't know what the Bible says. Yeah.
Okay, number 16. What role does deception play in Jacob's relationship with Esau? Albie, what do you have for that?
Well, it was a central theme in he and Esau's life that he constantly tried at the insistence of his mother to deceive Jacob and gain advantage over Esau. He got some tense there that he had to leave and go to Laban because Esau would most likely have killed him if he remained.
That's right. And that's not the way to establish or continue a relationship, isn't it? You can see even from birth, when Jacob has hold of Esau's foot as he's coming out, and the prophecy that he is going to be a supplanter. In other words, he's going to take the place of his brother. And all through his life, you know, it seemed like there was that enmity between them, and part of that had to do with the favoritism that the parents showed. Rebekah favored Jacob, and Jacob, favored Esau, and so that didn't help the situation any at all. And we might could say that, you know, even that was what perpetuated it. But then in taking the blessing, the birthright that belonged to Esau, and receiving the father's blessing as well, was able to deceive. And so, as you state, it was an ongoing theme there. But nonetheless, it did turn out in the end to be a much better relationship between the two. Okay, now question 17. How does God reaffirm his promises to Jacob despite his flaws? Murphy, what do you have for that?
Okay, I have there by repeating the same promises to him that were made to Abraham and Isaac.
Okay, all right. He does reaffirm those to him. Any special significance about the way he does that, or what happened?
Didn't he make a vow to Jacob that he had all three promises despite his flaws?
He did. He did make that vow to him. What was the circumstance that surrounded that? Does anybody remember?
Jacob had just wrestled with the angel.
Okay. All right. And so God appears to Jacob in a dream. And you remember Jacob sees the ladder. And what is happening with that?
Angels are going down and going back up.
Okay, all right. Angels going up and down the ladder. The Lord standing at the top of that, and God blessed him as the God of Abraham and Isaac with the land, seed, and nation promises. And so those three promises were given, and God introduces himself to Jacob as, I am the God of your fathers. So he established the fact that this is not just some kind of strange dream that you're seeing. This is something that I'm presenting to you as the God of eternity, the God of creation, the God of your fathers. And so Jacob then, I think we see him begin to turn and do a little better with his life and being more obedient to God from that point forward. Number 18, what lessons can be learned from Joseph's experiences of betrayal and forgiveness? Betrayal and forgiveness. Alice, do you have that?
I put, even though people betray us and do us wrong, we have to forgive them in order to be pleasing to God.
Okay. All right. All right, good. Anything else? Anybody else have anything else?
Something to piggyback on, as like Alan said, trust God even when our own family betrays us. I cannot think of a more potent weapon that the devil could use to discourage us than to have our own flesh and blood betray us. Or maybe we can say when our own brethren can betray us, or when they become unfaithful. Again, referencing a sermon that I heard with Bill Hall, he said, discouragement is real. He said, I can tell you right now that at some point in your life, a person who's a child of God, who you put the most absolute trust in, that you thought would never be unfaithful, is going to do that. It does happen.
Yeah.
It also shows that regardless of how lost a situation may be, God has the power to right that and produce something good out of it.
Yes.
Especially like with Joseph.
Right. That's right. George, you had a comment you want to make?
Well, I was going to say that as Christians or believers of God, you leave all things in His hands. We do what we can, but of course, we have to realize that he is the final judge of all things.
Okay. All right. Yes, Dustin.
It doesn't just apply to his family there, it leads into the next question. So he's betrayed by his family, which puts him in Egypt. Once he gets to Egypt, he's maybe not necessarily, but he is set up for his life in a situation of betrayal where he is then put into prison. Still does good work there. He determines the dreams of the baker and the wine steward, and even though he's asked to remember, the steward does not. He betrays that memory, and only comes to him later in a moment where the Pharaoh is having a dream. He still doesn't remain faithful through all of this, and there is reward as it goes on. Like I said, that leads into the next question. But it happens all throughout his life. He doesn't become part over this.
Right.
He just keeps being a good steward of God throughout the course.
Right. That's right. He realizes it's not God's doing that has causing him suffering, but it is his will that he goes through these things to meet the expected end. One of the things that I thought about in connection with that is that favoritism and jealousy of partners. Here you've got favoritism again coming up in this family, and it comes from Jacob having Joseph as his favorite. You know, his favorite wife Rachel, his favorite son Joseph, and so that's, boils over into jealousy with his brethren, especially when Joseph tells them of his dreams. And people can be cruel about those types of things, even, your family. And so we see that here in this story. But a faithful man will see the good of God's will. And that's one of the things that Dustin was mentioning there, is that, over a period of time, it would be easy to just be bitter and hateful and ugly and not be interested in God and blaming God and those types of things. And we see it day after day when people try to blame God for something that in the very beginning they've gotten themselves into, and then when it don't turn out like they wanted to, they put the blame on God. So that was not the case with Joseph. He was a faithful man, and a faithful man can save many weak ones, as we see. Yes, Ellen?
That's, all that's is true. Also, Joseph did, when you were talking about favoritism, a little bit of that is Joseph's responsibility. What good was there to come from announcing to your brothers, I dream about you, all of you worshiping me. It was true that he dreamed that, and those things did happen, but I can see how that fed his brothers envy, and, it obviously was wrong what they did toward him, but he wasn't completely without responsibility, and his father, you can have things that you love about a certain child and not take it as far as he did,
Right.
as his father did, and then he kind of fed that a little bit. He certainly changed how he behaved toward his brothers in the end.
Yes.
And also, Mark was saying how much time it was between when he saw his brothers last. It would be interesting how he felt about them, how much his heart softened toward them over those years that they were.
Yeah, that's right.
Just wondering what age was Joseph when he shared those dreams, because he was 12 or 13. I could see in the intensity of the dream that he just wanted to share with everybody. Not pain.
Yeah.
But if he's older, then
Well, we know he was 17 when he was sold into slavery, so he would have been younger than that. But I think, I can see prophecy involved in that too, because it does fulfill itself later on. The interesting thing, though, to me is that Joseph didn't say, "See, I told you so." Yes, Murphy.
Talking about dreams, you go to the Hebrews and it's, the Hebrew writer says in time past, I'm trying to quote the passage, let me look at it. Sometimes when I do that, I make a mess of things. Hang on a minute.
Where are you going to in Hebrews?
Hebrews 1. God in verse 1, God who at sundry times and in divers or different manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophet. It said he did it in different manners. Therefore in different manners he spoke to Joseph in a dream.
Okay. Dusty, you have something you want to say?
I was thinking about the passage you wrote, and what she brought up, how his heart softened over time. He did test it for once they got there. It's hard to not soften until they saw that they had actually changed. And that Simeon, I believe it was willing to give himself in place of Benjamin coming down to Egypt just because he wanted, he's trying to be a peacemaker there, and they actually had changed. They were trying to spare Benjamin because they knew the suffering that Jacob had been through after the loss of Joseph. And this is what, I believe the Bible says he finally breaks. He has to be away from them. And, he softens quite a bit. He's actually weeps.
Right.
And he starts the revealing process of what is going on.
Yeah. I think there was as much change in the brothers as there was, anybody, because we really see how that they understood over time that they had made a terrible mistake in what they did. George?
Well, it brought to mind Romans 8:28, the situation with Joseph and how everything. And we need all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. That verse goes right with that to me.
Yeah. All right, good. Anything else on that particular question? All right, let's go then to question 19. How does God use hardship in Joseph's life to accomplish a greater purpose? What do you think about that? Mark?
Just how the examination to fulfill that promise.
Okay. All right. Don't feel bad about this. This was not you, it was God. And God sent me down here to save you, to preserve life. And so that's exactly what came out of all of that. Through that series of events, God guided Joseph to the position he needed to be in to save his family, ultimately God's chosen people, that great nation that Mark talked about. All right. Number 20, how does the book of Genesis set the foundation for the rest of the Bible? You have that, Miss Janice? Miss Janice, do you have that? Number 20? Number 20, do you have the answer to that?
Well, he created the heavens and the earth, and he wanted us to live based on how he taught Adam and Eve, if they had lived like that, but they sort of sinned a little bit, and we've been trying to live based on the Bible in a sense, but we still commit sins, but we're forgiven. He forgave Adam and Eve, so I guess he's forgiven us.
Okay, all right. Creation's very foundational, isn't it?
Yes.
This is where everything starts. And without that record, we would lose so much of our understanding of God and what he's done for us and what he's created and the purpose for all of that. I mean, I've said it, and I'm sure you're tired of hearing me say it, but the line that runs from Genesis all the way through Revelation, that is there so that we can understand that God used and saw the end from the beginning, but he used that to bring Christ into the world, used us to bring Christ into the world and to offer him as a sacrifice for our sins. The spotless Lamb of God. Yes, Murphy?
Another way, what I put up, it shows his almighty power, his perfection, and then It reveals the coming of Jesus by prophecy. The first messianic prophecy is Genesis 3:15.
All right. Where he talks about the seed. Okay. Very good. Any final questions or comments about Genesis before we move into our introduction of Exodus? Yes, Dustin.
Something that I thought about all throughout the study of this. There is a distinct difference between what the birthright is. It is not just a matter of property, it is not just a matter of, inheritance. There is a knowledge there, a sacred knowledge, that is passed only to a very specific individual as that bloodline moves forward through that patriarch. Am I far off in that line of thinking?
I don't think so, from the standpoint that it shows the preservation of the line of descendants, and it shows the preservation of those that ancestry to bring us to Christ. And while there may have been, an understanding of that among all the families, just use Joseph and his brothers, for example, there might have been some understanding about all of that. Really, it was not cemented into their minds until Jacob skips over Reuben, Simeon, and Levi and puts the blessing with Judah. Because there he says Judah will be a tribe or a nation of kings. And he sets that in stone, and he shows how that will go through that lineage and how that Christ will come through that lineage. So that revelation there maybe is more clear. It brings the understanding of the messianic line more clearly than any other passage that they had, or any other knowledge rather, that they had received up to that point in time. And we don't see that necessarily remembered over and over again beyond this, but the point is so concrete that we recognize that to be true as Judah's line goes forward. And then even in the New Testament, where in the Psalms and Proverbs, where the line of Judah is talked about, that cements that line, that messianic line that Jesus is coming through that. So that's a good point, I think. All right, anything else? Okay, let's go on into our introduction to Exodus and talk about that for just a little bit. One of the things that I want us to understand and consider as we go into the introduction of this book in particular, or this study in particular, we're not just introducing Exodus, we're really introducing Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and just maybe a chapter of Joshua, is that we don't have any concrete evidence of when the Israelites came out of Egypt, rather. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. There's a couple of dates that scholars generally think. One of them is, I think, to me, more biblically sound than the other. We don't really know anything about the pharaohs. We do know that at one point in time there was a change in the rule in Egypt. But the main thing is that whatever we consider, whatever we understand about that, we want to make sure that we're following the revelation of all of these events. Of course, that has to do, and that's obvious to us all, I think, has to do with anything that we study. So, basically, when Genesis ends, two important patriarchs have died. We've got Jacob and Joseph. Both have died. Jacob has been taken to the cave of Machpelah and buried there with great pomp, if you will, from the Egyptian people as well as his own, and they came back voluntarily into the land. And they came back knowing that they would have a place to live. And you remember we talked a little bit about that from Genesis chapter 50, that the brothers were concerned that Joseph was then going to take the opportunity to turn on them. And Joseph said, what, am I in the place of God? You know, I'm not doing this. We're all going to live peaceably here together. And so he explains that to them. And so they continue to live there in the land of Goshen. They continue to prosper. And they prosper to the extent that they are becoming a large people now. So on Joseph's deathbed, he promised his family that God would visit them and take them into the land of Canaan. He also asked them to promise him that after he was embalmed and placed in a casket, that they would return his bones to the land of Canaan when they left. And so I want to talk about this word visit for just a minute. This is the idea of being rescued. God is going to come. He's going to visit you. He's going to rescue you. And this is not, the word visit is in the Bible is used several different ways, but in this particular instance, he's talking about coming and rescuing the people of Israel. And so it may very well have been that they were already in some kind of difficulty in the land of Egypt at the time of Joseph's death. The Bible doesn't tell us that that is the case, but it does foreshadow some things that are coming. And so this, as I mentioned, visit suggests pending trouble for the people of Israel. However, God would be with his people even though they were now in a foreign land. What did God, do you remember back in our study of the book of Genesis, what did God say to Isaac when there was a famine in the land? This is not during Abraham's time now, but in Isaac's time there was a famine in the land. And he told him, he said, don't go to Egypt. What was his purpose for telling?
Well, I believe it was the same reason that the people going into the land in Jacob's time, they were in a land with a strange people, and they were going to be influenced by them no matter where they were in the land. And it proved out in Exodus that some are influenced by that.
Right. I think that's a good answer. And when we think about that, we think, well, you know, he told Isaac not to go down to Egypt at this point in time. But I think the temptation also is for Isaac to stay. Because he's not a great nation. He doesn't have a lot of about when God told him not to go down. But there's a real danger that he might stay down there. And so God says, don't do that. You go down here to the south, down close to Beersheba, and so that's what he did. And so now that they are in a foreign land of necessity because of that famine and Joseph's rise to power and all of that, God is still with them. He's going to be with them, but he's going to bring them out. And that's what Joseph's getting at when he talks about visiting. God will visit you and take you out back to the land of Canaan. Now, it's very interesting that we go back to, and I may have pointed this out in another slide, but we go back to 3000 BC and we can find Egyptian records. And they are meticulous, and they're also in very good shape because of the type of climate that the Egyptians lived in. It's very arid. Right. And they were able to keep those. But you get down to about 1750, and the records stop. Right. And then you go down to about 1550, and the records pick up again. Right. And so what's going on with that? So we'll try to answer that question as we go along. So the Bible is our only source of information about the people during this period of time. And of course, that's as we would like it to be. You know, we like to have that information from the Bible because we're not jaded by something else that might be said that might or might not be historical. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 15 and look at verses 13 through 16. Ken, if you would read that for us when you get there. Genesis 15, 13 through 16.
And he said unto Abraham, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. I will judge, and afterwards they shall come out with great substance.
Through 16.
Okay. And thou shalt go into thy fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full.
Okay. All right, so who is speaking there? God. Okay, to whom is he speaking? Abram. Okay, and so many years before these events, God prophesied to Abram that this will happen. And in this section, in this particular scripture, he uses as we go along. So as I mentioned earlier about dating the Exodus, it's nearly impossible to know the date of the Exodus for various reasons. Moses, in his record, names no Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a title, right? It was the king of Egypt. That's what that meant. But pharaohs had names as well, specific names. Amenhotep was one of the pharaohs. And a lot of people try to put the Exodus in the time of Amenhotep, but that's not really accurate. And there were others. Ramses was one of the pharaohs. Ramses II was one of the pharaohs. And so there's a great period of time between those two. They weren't right after one another. But nonetheless, Moses gives us none of those names. As I mentioned earlier, the Egyptians kept no records of this time. And so we don't know anything from historical records. Archaeological evidence is not conclusive. There are, as you know, and this is kind of hard for me because I'm not an archaeological guy, obviously. I like history, but I don't know anything about archaeology. But they tell me that over a period of time, that if you dig, then you're going to dig down to a certain level and you'll find certain records for a certain period of time. That's right. And then if it's an ancient city, you dig down further and you're going to find older records from a certain period of time. And so excavations at the point in time when this particular material was written, and that's what I have to go by because I'm not one of those guys that follows archaeology, obviously. Were those records and those things were inconclusive. And so that, again, doesn't tell us a lot about where we date the Exodus, although there are general ideas about that because of what is said from that are generally upheld by scholars as possibilities. 1450 BC and 1290 BC. And so which of those is the older time? 1450, right. So as we get closer to the day of Christ, obviously the years get fewer and fewer because everything is dated from the birth of Christ. Did I say death of Christ? Birth of Christ. Biblical evidence points to 1450, and I'm not going to get in this really deep, but I just want to point up a few things. And the reason this is not really material to our understanding of the Exodus, but in case you run into it, then you'll have knowledge to combat that. Jephthah was one of the judges. We remember Jephthah from his rash vow. But Jephthah's work was involving those on the Transjordan Plateau, the Amorites, for example. And in Judges chapter 11 and verse 26, he tells the king on that occasion that the Israelites have inhabited the area of the Transjordan, that is the eastern side of the Jordan Valley, for 300 years. So what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything unless we can date the time of Jephthah. And we can do that to a fairly certain degree. Solomon, and the reason I bring up Jephthah and Solomon is because if you say that 1290 BC is the time of the Exodus, well, the 430 years really causes a conflict there, because that would put you in the time of Solomon. And so that causes a conflict. But Solomon built the temple 480 years after the Exodus. 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 tells us that. And so we can pretty much know what the time of Solomon is. If you go back to our study of the history and geography of the Bible story, there's 2 or 3 chapters there that has timelines of the kings of Israel and Judah. You go back to the United Kingdom portion of that, and you'll see a reasonable dating of the time when Solomon was king. And so you take 480 years, add 480 years to that, and you get a good idea of when the Exodus is, and it's somewhere around 1500 to 1450 BC. All right, so whatever that's worth, there it is. Also, we learn from the book of Genesis that the Pharaoh that lived during the time of Joseph was what kind of Pharaoh to Joseph?
Favorable.
Friendly, a favorable one, yes. So he was, we would say, I guess in our terminology, we would say he's a good guy. He was a good Pharaoh. And so these people, or these pharaohs, or these people that ruled Egypt during this particular time were not Egyptians. They were referred to as the Hyksos kings, and that comes from, and we'll see in the next slide, an idea of them being shepherd kings. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So they're thought to have invaded and ruled Egypt from 1750 to 1550 BC. And you say, well, how do we know that? I mean, we don't hear anything from Egyptian history about these people. Well, that's why there were no records kept, because Egyptians were very proud. But we do have some archaeological proof that that was the case. As I mentioned earlier, meticulous Egyptian records go back to at least 3000 BC, but suddenly stop about 17 BC, picking up about 200 years later, 1750 BC, picking up about 200 years later. It is possible that this conquering people was the Amorites. We don't know that that's the case, but it's possible that that is the case. Hyksos, it was spelled H-Y-C-S-O-S, as we would translate that from Egyptian into English originally. I mean, shepherd kings. That would certainly explain why the Pharaoh of Joseph's day had herds, and why he knew to place Jacob's family in Goshen, because the Egyptians despised shepherds and herdsmen. And so here we have a Pharaoh and a people that's ruling Egypt, and they shepherds and so we have this situation here where the Pharaoh would be favorable to Joseph and understanding of him and his family and his plight and his situation with his family being shepherds. And so you need to build here in the land of Goshen, away from the mass of the Egyptian people, and you'll prosper there. It's also very possible that these kings were of the same race as Hammurabi of Babylon. Hammurabi was a very, very prosperous king in the region of Babylon in early days before Christ. And so he is very famous. A lot's been written about him. They also, the Babylonians, kept good records at this point. I mentioned a moment ago we do have one piece of archaeological evidence in regard to this relationship between the Hyksos kings and the Egyptians. There was a stele, a piece of stone, that was found in, I believe it was 1964. I believe my date's correct. It may be 1854 or so. One of those two is either 1854 or 1964. I can't remember exactly. I believe Brother Walden refers to that. It talks about, and this is from the writing of Manetho. He was an Egyptian scribe or an Egyptian historian. He talked about this people that came in, and this is quoted through Josephus. We have this in Josephus' book. Josephus is quoting Manetho. And he says, we have this people that came in, and somehow or another they took over our kingdom without even a fight. And so, this kind of phraseology is kind of suspect. But what Josephus is trying to do is he's trying to tie that to the Israelites. Well, we know, first of all, Jacob didn't come in as a fighting king. He came in at the invitation of his son Joseph and Pharaoh. What this really is referring to is these shepherd kings that we're talking about here. And so that's kind of the archaeological evidence there. You can read more about that if you like through Josephus' writings. So it appears that the Egyptians drove these kings out about the same time that Joseph died. May have been 50 years prior, may have been a little bit later. Well, not 50 years, it wouldn't have been that long. It may have been a few years prior to Joseph's death, we don't know. Well, whatever the case, as with the dating of the book, we will confine our thoughts to the Bible record in that connection. The slavery of the Israelites in Egypt began and reached its height before Moses' birth. And we'll study, and I'm sure you remember how the Pharaoh decided that to keep this people from prospering, he would kill all the babies, the male babies, and so we know that Moses escaped that by the providence of God and was taken care of and raised in Pharaoh's household. As we begin the book of Exodus, Jacob's family is listed as 70 souls. Now, we talked about that in our study of Genesis when there were some conflicting thoughts about how many people there were in Jacob's family, whether or not, there were 67 or 64 or 70. But Exodus tells us in the first few verses, beginning with chapter 1 and verse 1. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household, and he lists the sons there. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. And all the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. And so it makes it clear about the numbering there. And so Joseph, his brethren, and all of that generation, see, I've got a misspelling there, had died in Egypt. That's what the book of Genesis tells us in verse 6 of chapter 1. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. So here we're beginning to see, after the death of Joseph and his brothers, the fulfillment of that nation promise, where they're not quite there yet, but they're beginning to become a great people, for the land of Egypt is filled with them. They have prospered greatly. So God is starting to fulfill his promises. Abraham didn't see it. Isaac didn't see it. Jacob didn't see it. Joseph didn't see it. Judah didn't see it. But he's starting to fulfill that promise, and Moses is later going to take out a great company of people into the wilderness, and God is going to call them his people and give them a law, as we'll soon see. Okay, that's all I have for this morning. We've got just a few minutes left. Is there any comments or questions about what you, all right, George first.
Well, you were talking about archaeology earlier. From what I've heard and seen, you know, where they got most of the evidence from, which was sort of humorous to me, they always looked for garbage dumps. And they dug up, and they could tell by what was there, and it's in layers as well, you know, what period of time it was. I thought that was pretty remarkable. Plus, I heard on the news lately, it's one of the few things I've heard that I paid much attention to, is they found chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea, encrusted with coral. So, you know, it states, you know, some people say it's during the time of the Exodus, but it's debatable. And that's typical.
Yeah. Okay. Murphy, you had a comment?
Okay, on page 249 in the appendix, the date of that stela is 1954.
1954, okay.
1954, the second paragraph.
Okay.
From the top.
All right.
Pass it on.
Very good.
What page is that?
That was in the appendix in the back of the book on page 254, is that right? Is that what you said?
Hang on a minute. Actually, that's 249.
249.
The date is 1954, the page is 249.
All right, right there in the middle there.
In the middle.
Anything else? Yes, Ken?
Yeah, around 2010, 2012, there was a movie that went into a lot of the dating of this and had a very different view of something, and they had really nice graphics showing, well, this, if we could just put this in here and the whole thing moved over. It was very well done. I think I have access to that, but I'll have to check. I feel like it's on YouTube now.
Was it true?
Well, it covered this whole thing that we're talking about. And I think it did a creditable job, but I wasn't well enough informed back then to make use of it.
Okay. All right, very good. All right, thank you for your time, your attention this